Rita Hayworth was the prototype. Kim Novak was the spare part. For years, the public viewed them as rivals fighting for the crown. In reality, they were inventory processing through the same machinery, owned by the same man. One fought to keep her dignity. The other fought to keep her sanity. That man was Harry Cohn. As the absolute monarch of Columbia Pictures, he operated his studio like a surveillance state. In a town of predators, he was the shark that never slept, reportedly wiring the entire lot with microphones to harvest leverage against his own employees. To Cohn, an actor was simply an asset with a pulse. And in 1937, he claimed his most lucrative prize, a shy Spanish dancer, exhausted from the nightclub circuit, unaware she had just been sold to a man who collected people. When Margarita Cancino first walked onto the Columbia lot, she was undeniably beautiful, but she was ethnic in a way that Hollywood in the 1930s found unacceptable. She had a low hairline that crowded her forehead, dark eyes, and a distinctly Mediterranean look. To Harry Cohn, she was a diamond in the rough, but the process of polishing her would require stripping away every trace of her heritage. He intended to change her biology. The transformation of Margarita Cancino into Rita Hayworth was a total reconstruction. Cohn and his team decided that to be an American star, she needed an American hairline. For over a year, she was forced to undergo electrolysis, a primitive and agonizing procedure where a thin metal probe was inserted into each individual hair follicle on her forehead to shock the root with electricity. Day after day, hour after hour, they burned the Spanish out of her. They raised her hairline by an inch, reshaping her face to open it up, creating the broad, noble forehead that the cameras loved. Then came the hair itself. Her midnight black hair was dyed a vibrant chemical red. She was put on starvation diets to sculpt her curves into the hourglass shape that would later adorn the side of atomic bombs. By the time the process was finished, Margarita Cancino was gone. In her place stood Rita Hayworth, a creature of pure artifice, a woman designed by committee to be the ultimate object of desire. The investment paid off in ways even Cohn hadn't imagined. Throughout the 1940s, Rita Hayworth became the single most important financial engine of Columbia Pictures. She was the Technicolor dream that kept the lights on. In films like CoverGirl and You Were Never Lovelier, she radiated a joy and sensuality that seemed effortless. But the crowning moment and the beginning of the end was Gilda in 1946. In that film, she performed a striptease where she removed only a single glove, yet it was more erotic than total nudity. The scene cemented her status as the love goddess, a title she despised. The image of Gilda became so powerful, it eclipsed the woman playing her. Her likeness was literally painted onto the atomic bomb, dropped on Bikini Atoll. She was destruction and desire fused into one. But while the world saw a goddess, Harry Cohn saw a piece of property that was beginning to malfunction. The relationship between the star and the mogul was one of the most toxic in Hollywood history. Cohn felt he had bought and paid for Rita. He had made her, and therefore he owned her. He became obsessively jealous, not out of romantic love, but out of the possessiveness of a collector. He monitored her dates, he criticized her clothes, and he raged when she tried to assert any independence. He viewed her personal life as a breach of contract. Every time she fell in love, Cohn took it as a personal insult. And Rita, desperate to be loved for herself rather than the image Cohn had created, began to rebel. Her rebellion was a desperate flight into the arms of men she hoped would save her. First, it was the genius director Orson Welles. When she married Welles, she was trying to prove she had a mind, that she could be an intellectual equal. not just a pinup. In a move that nearly gave Harry Cohn a heart attack, she allowed Wells to cut off her famous red hair and dye it platinum blonde for the film The Lady from Shanghai. It was a desecration of the brand. The film flopped and the marriage failed, leaving Rita more isolated than ever. Then came the ultimate escape attempt. In 1949, she did the unthinkable. She walked away. She married Prince Ali Khan and left Hollywood for Europe, breaking her contract and leaving Columbia Pictures without its primary source of income. To Cohn, this was desertion. It was treason. He suspended her contract, froze her salary, and waited. He knew something that Rita didn't. Freedom is expensive, and eventually the bird always has to fly back to the cage. The marriage to the prince was a disaster, marred by infidelity and cultural isolation. By the early 1950s, Rita was broke, exhausted, and humiliated. She had no choice but to return to the only man who would pay her bills, Harry Cohn. Her return to Columbia was a surrender. Cohn welcomed her back, but the dynamic had shifted. He was now a vindictive jailer. He punished her with mediocre scripts and refused to meet her salary demands, knowing she had no leverage. But even as he exploited her, he began to look at her with a critical merchant's eye. He saw the fine lines appearing around her eyes. He saw the tiredness in her posture. He saw the alcohol she was using to numb the humiliation of her failed marriages and her suffocating career. The asset was depreciating. The love goddess was mortal. And for a studio head, mortality is bad for business. However, while the woman was mortal, the Rita Hayworth concept, the red-headed siren, the compliant vessel, remained valuable. He simply needed a new model to execute the formula. He required a compliant version, one that wouldn't talk back, wouldn't marry princes, and wouldn't age. And so somewhere in the dark, smoke-filled offices of Columbia Pictures in 1953, a decision was made that would shatter another life. If the original model was broken, he would not fix it. He would simply manufacture a spare part. He would find a girl, any girl, with the right raw materials, and he would put her through the same machine that had ground Margarita Cancino into dust. He would prove to Rita and to the world that stars were not born. They were made, and they could be replaced. He cast his net wide, looking for a lump of clay he could mold into a weapon. He looked towards the Midwest, towards a shy, awkward girl stepping off a train from Chicago, completely unaware that she was about to be drafted into a war she didn't know existed. By the winter of 1954, the corridors of Columbia Pictures felt less like a movie studio and more like a kingdom in the midst of a succession crisis. The Rita Hayworth problem had become the obsession of every executive on the payroll. She was back in the fold, yes, but she was bruised, cynical, and increasingly unreliable. She had returned from her marriage to the prince not as the conquering hero, but as a woman who had seen the world outside the studio walls and could no longer pretend that the soundstage was paradise. Harry Cohn looked at her and saw a depreciating asset. He saw the lines of exhaustion around her eyes that the makeup artist had to work harder to conceal. He saw the defiance in her posture that no contract could legally suppress. He needed an insurance policy. He needed to prove to the shareholders, and perhaps more importantly to himself, that the magic of the love goddess was not inherent to the woman, but inherent to the system that created her. If he could do it once with a Spanish dancer, he could do it again with anyone. He just needed the raw material. He required obedient, malleable clay rather than raw talent. He found that clay in a place that couldn't have been further removed from the sun-drenched glamour of Los Angeles. He found it in the gray, wind-swept streets of Chicago. in the form of a 21-year-old girl named Marilyn Pauline Novak. Marilyn Novak was seemingly the least likely candidate for stardom. Unlike the ambitious starlets who practiced autographs in mirrors, or the vaudeville kids trained to perform, Marilyn was a ghost in her own life. Born to a history teacher and a railroad clerk, Marilyn was a child of the Depression-era Midwest, sturdy, Catholic, and deeply repressed. She was a girl of silence. As a teenager, she felt so out of place in her own body, so awkward in her towering height. She was nearly 5'7" by the time she was a teenager, towering over the boys in her class, that she often wished she could simply disappear. She didn't dream of red carpets. She dreamed of canvases. She was a painter, an artist who preferred the smell of turpentine and oil paint to the gaze of other people. She found solace in riding her bicycle for miles through the Chicago suburbs, escaping a home life that was loving but emotionally stifled. She was painfully shy, the kind of crushing, paralyzing shyness that makes it difficult to breathe in a crowded room. The idea that this terrified, introverted girl would soon be positioned as the world's next great sex symbol is one of the darkest ironies of the 20th century. Her journey to Hollywood was an accident of fate, a series of stumbling blocks that led her to the edge of a cliff. During a summer break from junior college, she took a job modeling simply to pay for art school. That modeling gig led to a cross-country tour demonstrating refrigerators, a mundane, unglamorous job that required her to stand still and look pleasant while men discussed freezer capacity. It was on this tour that she ended up in Los Angeles, just another face in a crowd of extras. She had no interest in a contract. She was simply waiting for the train back to Chicago. But in Hollywood, beauty is a form of gravity, and Marilyn Novak had a gravitational pull that she wasn't even aware of. She appeared as an extra in an RKO film, standing in the background doing absolutely nothing. Yet when the rushes were screened, eyes were drawn to her. There was something about her, a heaviness, a sullen, sleepy quality that looked like boredom, but read on camera as simmering sexuality. An agent spotted her, and within days she was standing in front of the desk of Max Arnow, the casting director at Columbia. Arnow saw the potential, but he also saw the problems. She was too heavy, her teeth were crooked, her nose was too broad, and she was terrified. But he sent her up the chain of command straight into the lion's den. In their first meeting, Cohn evaluated the girl from Chicago with the cold stare of a butcher eyeing a side of beef. He sneered at her terrified face, commented on her weight, and made derogatory slurs about her Polish heritage. He was deliberately trying to break her, to test her resilience. This was Cohn's standard operating procedure. Humiliate the subject to see if they submit. If they fight back with fire, like Rita eventually did, it's a problem. If they crumble, they are useful. Marilyn Novak didn't fight back. She froze. She retreated inward, her eyes going wide and vacant with panic. And in that vacancy, Cohn saw his canvas. He saw that her fear could be marketed as mystery. He saw that her silence could be sold as a lure. He signed her for a pittance, starting at $75 a week, a fraction of what the janitors at the studio were making, and ordered the machine to start grinding. The transformation of Marilyn Novak into Kim Novak was a process of industrial alchemy, rapid and ruthless. It began, as it always did with Cohn, with the erasure of identity. He hated her name. Marilyn was already taken by Monroe at Fox, and Cohn refused to have his star be a second-rate version of a competitor. He wanted to call her Kit Marlowe. It sounded British, theatrical, and completely unlike the girl from Chicago. For the first and only time in the early stages, the girl fought back. She told him, her voice trembling but firm, that she wouldn't be Kip Marlowe. She was a Novak. It was her family name, the only thing she had left of the life she was leaving behind. The argument raged, but eventually a compromise was struck. She would keep Novak, but Marilyn had to go. She would be Kim, short, punchy, modern. With the name settled, the physical demolition began. Cohn ordered her to lose nearly 20 pounds in a matter of weeks. She was put on a regimen of starvation diets and, as was common in the studio system of the era, likely prescribed amphetamines to kill her appetite and keep her energy up during the grueling days. The studio dentist capped her teeth to give her a blinding uniform smile. Her hairline, unlike Rita's, didn't need electrolysis, but her hair color became a matter of national security. Cohn didn't want the warm, honey blonde of a girl next door. He wanted something icier, something unearthly. The studio hairdressers experimented with chemical cocktails until they found a shade of platinum that was almost white, but with a strange lavender rinse. Under the studio lights, her hair seemed to glow with a violet aura. It was artificial, metallic, and stunning. It made her look like she had been beamed down from a spaceship rather than born in Illinois. They reshaped her eyebrows into severe arched wings that gave her a permanent expression of skepticism and haughtiness. They took away her comfortable clothes, her slacks and oversized shirts, and encased her in corsets and gowns that were engineered to reshape her silhouette. But the physical transformation was the easy part. The psychological remodeling was where the true cruelty lay. Cohn knew she couldn't act. She had no training, no technique, and when the cameras rolled, she would often stiffen up like a deer in headlights. Most studio heads would have sent her to acting classes for years before putting her on screen. Cohn didn't have years. He wanted to hurt Rita Hayworth now. He hired acting coach Benno Schneider to construct Kim Novak. Schneider realized he could not teach her to project emotion. Instead, he taught her to simply think the character's thoughts, letting the camera find the result. The studio weaponized her terror. Her hesitation before speaking became mystery. Her stiff posture became regal poise. Cohn forbade her from wearing a bra, calculating that the contrast between her icy face and unconstrained form would provoke the censors and drive box office sales. While Kim was being subjected to this boot camp, the studio publicity machine began to spin the narrative. Before the public had even seen a frame of her film, they were told that a new goddess had arrived. Gossip columnists fed press releases directly from Cohn's office, began to drop hints. They wrote about this mysterious beauty who was younger, fresher, and more exciting than the tired stars of the 1940s. The comparison was never subtle. Every article that praised Kim Novak was a covert dagger aimed at Rita Hayworth. The debut came with the film Pushover in 1954. It was a film noir, a genre that suited Kim's limitations perfectly. She played a femme fatale, a role that required her to be beautiful, duplicitous, and emotionally detached. When the film was released, the marketing campaign was aggressive. Posters plastered across America didn't ask, "Who is she?" They declared, "Hollywood's newest sensation." The premiere was a blur for Kim. She was shoved in front of flashbulbs that blinded her, asked questions she didn't know how to answer. She was 21 years old, starving, terrified, and wearing a face that wasn't hers. But when the box office receipts came in, Harry Cohn smiled. The public bought it. They lined up around the block. They fell in love with the lavender blonde ghost. To Cohn, the numbers on the ledger were proof of his genius. He had taken a frightened girl from the Midwest and turned her into a gold mine. But in the background of this meteoric rise, a dark counter-narrative was playing out. As Kim's star ascended, Rita Hayworth was watching from the sidelines, and the view was devastating. Rita had returned to the studio to find her dressing room reassigned, her scripts given to the new girl, and the staff who used to fawn over her now whispering in corners. She walked past the rows of posters for pushover lining the studio walls, posters that featured a woman who was being styled to look exactly like a younger, blonder version of herself. The studio actively replicated Rita's mannerisms, wardrobe, and lighting on a stranger. Rita saw Cohn lavishing the same obsession on Kim, recognizing that this attention was a consuming fire. In late 1954, the dynamic shifted from preparation to active warfare. Cohn felt secure enough in his new creation to start using her as a bludgeon. When Rita refused a script because it was poorly written, Cohn didn't argue. He simply leaked to the press that Rita was difficult and hinted that the role might go to Kim Novak. When Rita complained about her salary, Cohn pointed to the grosses of Kim's movies, which were made for a fraction of the cost. "Why should I pay for a vintage model?" he reportedly sneered to his aides, "when the new model runs cheaper and doesn't talk back." Kim, for her part, was living in a state of constant anxiety. She wasn't enjoying the fame. She was surviving it. She lived in a small apartment, still driving a modest car, while the studio made millions off her image. She was keenly aware that she was being used. She would later write about the feeling of being an imposter, of waiting for the moment when the world would realize she was just Marilyn from Chicago and the whole house of cards would collapse. She wasn't trying to destroy Rita Hayworth. She was just trying not to be destroyed by Harry Cohn. She looked at Rita not with the eyes of a rival, but with the eyes of a child watching a parent suffer, terrified that the hereditary disease was coming for her next. By the end of 1955, the setup was complete. The studio had two goddesses on the payroll. One was the legend, wounded and wary, fighting to maintain her dignity. The other was the phenomenon, young and trembling, fighting to maintain her sanity. Harry Cohn sat in the middle, the puppet master, with tangled strings, ready to jerk them both into a collision course. The public was hungry for a showdown. The press was sharpening their knives, and in the executive offices, plans were already being drawn up for a project that would force these two women into the same frame, a project designed to strip the old queen of her crown and place it on the head of the tearful successor. The gun was loaded, and Harry Cohn was about to pull the trigger. By 1956, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was fought with spies and satellites, but the Cold War inside Columbia Pictures was fought with ink and newsprint. Harry Cohn understood something fundamental about human nature. We love a rivalry. He knew that to truly elevate Kim Novak, he couldn't just market her as a star. He had to market her as a replacement. He needed a narrative of succession, a cruel fairy tale where the old queen is dethroned by the young princess. And to write this fairy tale, he weaponized the most powerful artillery in Hollywood, the gossip columnists. In the 1950s, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons were not merely journalists. They were the judge, jury, and executioner of public reputation. Their columns were syndicated in hundreds of newspapers, read by millions of Americans over breakfast every morning. A single sentence from Hopper could destroy a career. A glowing endorsement from Parsons could make a star overnight. Harry Cohn treated these women like unguided missiles that he could occasionally steer. He fed them exclusive scoops, gave them access to his stars, and in return they printed his version of the truth. The narrative Cohn fed them was brutal in its simplicity. Articles appeared with calculated frequency, painting Rita Hayworth as a spoiled, aging diva who had forgotten her place. They focused on her temperament, a code word for her refusal to be exploited. They zoomed in on her fluctuating weight and her failed marriages. "Is the sun setting on Gilda?" the headlines asked rhetorically. In the very same columns, often just inches away, were glowing puff pieces about Kim Novak. Kim was described as cooperative, humble, and hardworking. The press lauded her for doing her own grocery shopping and living quietly, contrasting her virtue against Rita's decadence. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy. By framing Kim as the anti-Rita, Cohn forced the public to choose sides. He turned his own studio into a gladiatorial arena. For Rita, reading these papers was a daily humiliation. She was watching her own obituary being written in real time. She saw the industry she had helped build turning its back on her, cheering for her obsolescence. For Kim, the praise was equally poisonous. She knew she wasn't the saint the papers were describing. She felt like a fraud, a cardboard cutout prop being used to bludgeon a woman she admired. She lived in constant terror of making a mistake, of revealing the anxious girl beneath the ice-blonde veneer. The pressure was so intense that Kim developed psychosomatic illnesses. She would break out in hives or lose her voice before big scenes, her body rebelling against the role she was forced to play. But if the press war was cruel, it was nothing compared to the shadow war Harry Cohn waged against their personal lives. To Cohn, a star's heart was just another organ that belonged to the studio. And in 1957, Kim Novak committed the ultimate sin against the studio system. She fell in love with the wrong man. The man was Sammy Davis Jr. In the stratified, segregated America of the 1950s, Sammy Davis Jr. was a paradox. He was one of the most famous entertainers in the world, a member of the Rat Pack possessed of immense talent and charisma. He moved in the highest circles of celebrity. Yet, because he was black, he was often forced to enter the very hotels he performed in through the kitchen. He could entertain white audiences, but he could not sleep in the same rooms or eat at the same tables. Kim Novak met Sammy at a nightclub, and the attraction was instantaneous and magnetic. On the surface, they were an impossible pair, the white, platinum blonde sex symbol and the black, Jewish vaudevillian. But beneath the surface, they were mirror images. Both were outsiders who had been led into the castle, but were never truly made welcome. Both felt the crushing loneliness of fame. Both were sensitive souls wearing masks to survive. They found in each other a rare safe harbor. They began to date quietly, sneaking moments away from the prying eyes of the press. But in Hollywood, there are no secrets. When Harry Cohn found out about the affair, his reaction was not just anger. It was apoplectic, nuclear rage. This wasn't just about insubordination. This was about the bottom line. In 1957, the idea of a white movie star, specifically one marketed as the Ice Princess, being romantically involved with a black man was not just a scandal, it was a career death sentence. Cohn knew that if the affair became public, Kim Novak's films would be banned in the southern states, the box office receipts would evaporate, the investment would be ruined. Cohn summoned Kim to his office. He didn't reason with her. He didn't ask her to end it. He ordered her to stop, screaming that she was throwing her career into the garbage. He forbade her from seeing Sammy. But Kim, showing a flash of the stubbornness she'd displayed over her name, refused. She was in love, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen. She continued to see Sammy. That was when Harry Cohn decided to stop playing the studio executive and start playing the gangster. Harry Cohn had deep, enduring ties to organized crime. He had grown up on the tough streets of New York, and he maintained friendships with mobsters like Johnny Roselli and the Chicago Outfit throughout his reign. He used them as muscle, as fixers, as the ultimate leverage when legal contracts failed. The story of what happened next is one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood lore. Reportedly, Cohn reached out to his contacts in the mob. The message was sent to Sammy Davis Jr., not through a lawyer, but through the underworld. The threat was specific, visceral, and terrifying. Sammy was told that if he did not break off the relationship with Kim Novak immediately, and if he did not marry a black woman within 48 hours to kill the rumors, he would lose his other eye. Sammy, who had already lost an eye in a car accident years prior, was being threatened with total blindness. They would break his legs. They would end his ability to perform, to see, to live. This intervention was terrorism. Cohn was willing to physically maim one of the world's greatest entertainers to protect the profit margins of a Kim Novak movie. Kim was terrified. Sammy was terrified. They were two young people in love, facing a machine that was willing to spill blood to keep them apart. The reality of the threat was undeniable. In Las Vegas, where the mob ruled, the word was law. Broken and cornered, Sammy Davis Jr. capitulated. He had no choice. In a heartbreaking, hasty ceremony, he paid a black dancer named Lorraine White a sum of money to marry him. It was a sham marriage, a staged event designed solely to appease Harry Cohn and the mobsters he commanded. Kim Novak read about the marriage in the papers. She was devastated. She understood that she had no agency, no freedom, no right to her own heart. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the bars were made of steel. The message from Cohn was clear. I own your face, I own your body, and I own your love. This was the state of mind of Kim Novak as she walked onto the set of Pal Joey in 1957. She was heartbroken, humiliated, and terrified. She had been stripped of her autonomy and forced to abandon the man she loved. And waiting for her on that set was Rita Hayworth. If Cohn thought he had broken Rita, he was mistaken. Rita had watched the Sammy Davis Jr. affair unfold from a distance, and she recognized the fingerprints of the monster. She knew the pain of having her personal life destroyed by the studio. When she looked at Kim now, she didn't see a rival. She saw a sister in trauma. But Cohn wasn't done. He had destroyed their personal happiness. Now he wanted to monetize their misery. He had cast them together in Pal Joey, not just to make a movie, but to stage a public execution. He structured the entire production to pit them against each other, day after day. The setup for Pal Joey was a minefield. The script was adapted from a Rodgers and Hart musical, but it was retooled to serve Cohn's narrative. Frank Sinatra, the male lead, was at the height of his ring-a-ding-ding swagger. He was the prize the two women were supposed to fight over. But the real fight began before a single camera rolled. It began with the credits. In Hollywood, billing is everything. It determines your value, your hierarchy, your legacy. Rita Hayworth's contract stipulated top billing. Her name had to appear first, above the title, above everyone else. She was the Queen of Columbia, and this was her right. But Frank Sinatra was now the biggest star in the world, and he wanted top billing. And Kim Novak, the rising star, couldn't be relegated to third place if Cohn wanted to sell her as the new queen. Cohn tried to maneuver. He tried to bully Rita into accepting second place. He told her she was old news, that Sinatra was the draw. But Rita, with nothing left to lose, dug in her heels. She threatened to walk. She threatened to sue. She knew that without her, the rivalry angle that Cohn was banking on would collapse. In the end, a compromise was reached, but it was a visual representation of the awkward, tense reality. The posters would list Frank Sinatra first, but Rita's name would be lifted graphically to be slightly higher, in a bizarre arc design, with Kim's name following. It was a petty, confusing solution to a petty problem, but it set the tone for the production. As filming began, the air on the soundstage was thick enough to choke on. The crew walked on eggshells. They were witnessing a collision of three massive, fragile egos, orchestrated by a sociopath sitting in the front office. Rita arrived on set with her defenses fully raised, expecting disrespect. Kim arrived trembling, expecting to be eaten alive. They were two women standing on the edge of a precipice. The director, George Sidney, yelled, "Action!" But the real drama wasn't in the script. It was in the eyes of the two women who were forced to look at each other and see the things they feared most, their past and their future. The stage was set for the final act of Harry Cohn's grand play, and he intended for it to end in blood. When the cameras finally began to roll on Pal Joey in the spring of 1957, the soundstage at Columbia Studios transformed into a claustrophobic experiment in psychological warfare. To the casual observer, it was just a movie set, lights, cables, craft services, the hum of industry. But to the three principal actors and the hundreds of crew members navigating the silence between takes, it was a minefield. Harry Cohn had not just approved a film, he had commissioned a documentary of his own cruelty. He had handed his stars a script that didn't just ask them to act, it asked them to bleed. The screenplay of Pal Joey served as a distorted mirror held up to the lives of the women starring in it. It was weaponized metafiction. Rita Hayworth was cast as Vera Simpson, a wealthy former exotic dancer who has married into money and been left widowed and lonely. Vera is a woman who knows her best days are behind her, a woman who has to use her checkbook to buy the affection of a younger, rakish man. For Rita, reading these pages must have felt like reading a transcript of her own nightmares. She was 39 years old, hardly old by normal standards, but geriatric in the eyes of a youth-obsessed industry. She was painfully aware that her box office power was waning. She was painfully aware that her own marriages had failed, leaving her emotionally bankrupt despite her fame. And here was Harry Cohn, forcing her to stand in front of a camera and play a has-been who is desperate for attention. He was forcing her to parody her own decline. In one of the film's most biting ironies, her character is a former stripper, a direct, unsubtle reference to the Gilda persona that Rita had spent a decade trying to escape. Cohn was rubbing her nose in it, forcing her to wear the skin of the creature she hated most. Across the dressing room divide sat Kim Novak, clutching a script that was equally insulting, though in a different frequency. She was cast as Linda English, the Mouse. That was the character's nickname. Linda was the innocent, naive, slightly vapid chorus girl who wins the heart of the hero simply by being young, fresh, and uncorrupted. If Rita was forced to play the past, Kim was forced to play the product. The role required her to be wide-eyed, passive, and blank. Exactly the accusations her critics hurled at her in real life. She was playing the dumb blonde stereotype that she had fought so hard to avoid. Cohn was effectively telling her, "This is all you are. You are the fresh meat. You are the replacement." And in the middle of this engineered tragedy stood Frank Sinatra. By 1957, Sinatra was not just a singer. He was a force of nature. He was the chairman of the board, riding high on his Oscar win for From Here to Eternity, a role, ironically, that he had secured through the same studio system. Sinatra was the chaotic variable in Cohn's equation. He was the prize the two women were contractually obligated to fight over. But Sinatra, with his sharp street instincts, saw exactly what was happening, and his reaction to it would drive the wedge between the women even deeper. The atmosphere on set was defined by a brutal hierarchy of respect. Sinatra, known for his impatience and his one-take philosophy, had zero tolerance for amateurs. He looked at Kim Novak with her terrified freezing, her need for direction, her reliance on feeling the scene before saying the lines, and he was merciless. Reports from the set suggest he was often cold to her, rolling his eyes when she flubbed a line, tapping his foot while she tried to find her motivation. He represented the old guard of professionalism, the kind that valued speed and precision. In contrast, Sinatra had a begrudging, genuine respect for Rita Hayworth. Rita was a pro. She had been dancing in heels since she was a toddler. She knew her light, she knew her angles, and she knew her lines. She didn't complain. She walked onto the mark, delivered the performance, and walked off. Sinatra recognized a fellow survivor of the studio trenches. This dynamic created a heartbreaking isolation for Kim. She wasn't just fighting for screen time. She was being ostracized by the two legends she was working with. She was the outsider, the imposter, that the script accused her of being. There is a pervasive myth that Rita and Kim were clawing at each other's eyes behind the scenes, engaging in shouting matches and diva behavior. The truth is far more tragic. There was mostly silence. It was a silence born of segregation. When the director, George Sidney, yelled, "Cut," the set would fracture. Rita would retreat to her dressing room, often alone, sometimes with a glass of scotch to steady her nerves. She didn't hold court. She didn't socialize. She was a woman conserving her energy for the battle. Kim, meanwhile, would retreat to her own trailer, often in tears, terrified that she was failing. She kept her door locked. She didn't dare approach Rita. How could she? She was the one usurping Rita's throne. She felt an immense guilt, a heaviness that made her movements on screen sluggish and dreamlike. She wanted to tell Rita that she didn't want this war, that she was just a soldier following orders, but the wall of ice that Cohn had built between them was too thick to breach. The visual language of the film reinforced this separation. The costume designer, Jean-Louis, who had created the iconic black satin gown for Gilda, was brought in to dress the combatants. For Rita, he designed clothes that were expensive, heavy, and dark. Rich velvets, deep blues, complex structures. She looked like a queen, yes, but a queen in mourning. She looked weighed down by her own wealth and history. For Kim, the wardrobe was light, pastel, and flimsy. Lavenders, pale pinks, soft fabrics that moved with the wind. The visual coding was sledgehammer subtle. Rita is the heavy past. Kim is the airy future. In every two-shot where they appeared together, the contrast was jarring. Rita was grounded, earthy, and tired. Kim was ethereal, glowing, and vacant. They weren't just playing characters. They were playing archetypes of the mother and the daughter, locked in a Freudian struggle for the affection of the father figure, Sinatra, or perhaps the audience itself. The cruelty of the production reached its peak during the musical numbers. Rita Hayworth was one of the greatest dancers in Hollywood history. Her movement was her language. But in Pal Joey, her musical moments are tinged with sadness. She sings, dubbed as was often the case, but performed with her soul, bewitched, bothered, and bewildered. It is a song of surrender, of a woman admitting she is a fool for a man who treats her poorly. Watching Rita perform this in 1957, with the context of her abusive marriages and her subjugation to Harry Cohn, is almost voyeuristic. She isn't acting the heartbreak. She is remembering it. Then there was the zip number. In this scene, Vera Simpson performs a high-class striptease to a reporter. It is a parody of the burlesque world she came from. Rita performs it with a mix of aggression and cynicism. She unzips her dress, she teases, but there is no joy in it. It is a woman mocking her own sexuality, mocking the very thing the audience came to see. It is a performance of defiance. Contrast this with Kim Novak's number, My Funny Valentine. Kim was not a singer. She was not a dancer. She was terrified of performing in front of a live crew. The scene required her to stand still and sing a ballad of unconditional love to Sinatra. Cohn ordered the lighting cameraman to bathe her in a soft, hazy glow, the kind of lighting reserved for religious icons. While Rita had to work, to dance, to sweat, to strip, Kim simply had to stand there and be beautiful. The juxtaposition was deliberate. It told the audience, Rita has to work for your love. Kim just deserves it because she is young. As the weeks dragged on, the strain began to show on Rita's face. The makeup artist had to work harder each morning to hide the puffiness from the previous night's drinking. The alcohol wasn't a party habit. It was anesthesia. She was enduring a daily public shaming. Every time she looked at the call sheet, she saw the reality. She was training her replacement. She was teaching the audience how to stop loving her. There's a particularly telling anecdote from the set involving a lunch break. The cast and crew were breaking for food. Sinatra, loud and surrounded by his entourage, held court in the center. Kim, feeling the chill of his disapproval, hurried away to her trailer to eat alone. And Rita? The great Rita Hayworth sat quietly with her hairdresser, eating a sandwich, looking at no one. A crew member later remarked that it was the loneliest sight he had ever seen. The love goddess was entirely alone in a room full of people whose salaries she effectively paid. This was the vultures' banquet. Harry Cohn was feeding off their insecurities. The press was feeding off the friction, and the public was feeding off the spectacle. But the two women at the center of the feast were starving. They were starving for kindness, for respect. Harry Cohn had set out to make a film about a bitch fight. Instead, by pushing them to their breaking points, he was accidentally capturing the souls of two women who were slowly realizing that the only way to win this game was to stop playing it. But before they could reach that realization, they had to film the ending. The ending where the script said one wins and one loses. The ending that would break the illusion forever. The production of Pal Joey careened toward its inevitable conclusion, a finale that had been written before the cameras even started rolling. The script demanded a resolution that mirrored the studio's corporate strategy. The older woman must step aside, and the younger woman must inherit the earth. The final scenes of the movie are among the most fascinating artifacts of 1950s cinema, not because of the dialogue, but because of the palpable, vibrating reality beneath the fiction. When Rita Hayworth, as Vera Simpson, tells Frank Sinatra to leave her and go to the young Kim Novak, she isn't just reciting lines. She is performing a public abdication. The scene was shot with a quiet intensity. Vera Simpson, the wealthy widow, looks at the young, naive Linda English and realizes she cannot compete with youth. She surrenders. Take him, the scene effectively says. He's yours. For Rita Hayworth, delivering these lines to the woman who was actively being marketed as her replacement required a reserve of dignity that few actors possess. She didn't play the scene with bitterness. She played it with a heartbreaking grace. She stood tall, her face composed, refusing to give Harry Cohn the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She handed over the crown, but she kept her regal bearing. Kim Novak, on the receiving end of this victory, looked anything but triumphant. If you watch the scene closely, her eyes are filled with a strange mixture of fear and apology. She played a woman who knew she was accepting a poisoned chalice. She takes the man, but she looks terrified of the future. The chemistry in that final moment wasn't romantic tension between Sinatra and Novak. It was a tragic, silent communion between Novak and Hayworth. It was the moment the twist of our story truly reveals itself. For months, the tabloids had sold the world a story of vicious rivalry. They wanted a catfight. They wanted hair-pulling and screaming matches. The twist that Cohn failed to anticipate was that Rita and Kim didn't hate each other. They were mirrors. Rita looked at Kim and saw the ghost of her younger self. Kim looked at Rita and saw her own future. She saw the ghost of Margarita Cancino. She saw a young, terrified girl with a bad dye job and a studio contract that she didn't understand. She saw the pliability, the eagerness to please, and the crippling insecurity that she herself had possessed in 1937. She knew exactly what was coming for Kim. She knew the pill addiction that often followed the starvation diets. She knew the loneliness of the empty dressing room. She knew the inevitable betrayal. Her coldness on set wasn't hatred. It was the distance one keeps from a car crash they know they cannot prevent. And when Kim Novak looked at Rita Hayworth, she saw her own prophecy. She saw the ghost of Christmas future. She saw what happened when the machine was done with you. She saw the exhaustion behind the glamour, the alcohol used to dull the sharp edges of exploitation. Kim later confessed in interviews that she felt a profound, overwhelming guilt every time she was in a scene with Rita. She felt like a thief. She knew she wasn't better than Rita. She was just newer. She was the latest model rolling off the assembly line, destined for the same scrap heap the moment her paint began to chip. The Rivalry was a marketing fiction covering a shared trauma. They were two inmates in the same high-security prison, occupying different cell blocks. They couldn't save each other. The walls were too high and the guards were too brutal, but they refused to destroy each other. The silence between them on the set of Pal Joey was not the silence of hostility. It was the silence of mutual paralyzed understanding. The film wrapped. It was released in late 1957 and became a massive box office hit. The public flocked to see the spectacle. The studio made millions. Harry Cohn had won. He had successfully pitted his two creations against each other, extracted the maximum value from their pain, and proven that the love goddess was a transferable title. But victory in Hollywood is often the prelude to a funeral. In February 1958, mere months after the release of Pal Joey, the architecture of the conflict collapsed. Harry Cohn, the iron-fisted dictator of Columbia Pictures, the man who had terrified thousands and reshaped the lives of Rita and Kim, suffered a massive heart attack. He died in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. The king was dead. His funeral was one of the largest gatherings in Hollywood history. It was held on a soundstage at the studio, a fittingly theatrical end for a man who viewed life as a production. Thousands of people attended. The crowd was so large it spilled out onto Gower Street. But the atmosphere was not one of collective grief. It was an atmosphere of collective relief, mixed with a morbid curiosity. It was at this funeral that the comedian Red Skelton delivered one of the most famous and devastating lines in entertainment history. Looking out at the sea of mourners, he quipped to a reporter, "It proves what they always say. Give the public what they want, and they'll come out for it." They hadn't come to pay respects. They had come to make sure he was actually dead. They had come to see the casket closed on an era of terror. For Rita Hayworth and Kim Novak, the death of Harry Cohn was a seismic event. The monster who had orchestrated their torment was gone. The man who had bugged their offices, threatened their lovers, and commodified their bodies was in the ground. But the tragedy of abuse is that it doesn't end when the abuser dies. The systems he built were still in place, the contracts were still valid, and the scars he had carved into their psyches were permanent. Rita Hayworth did not dance on his grave. By 1958, she was too tired for vengeance. The death of Cohn left a vacuum in her career. He had been her tormentor, yes, but he had also been the architect of her stardom. Without him to fight against, without him to push her, she began to drift. The years of fighting for every scrap of dignity had exhausted her. She was free from his immediate grasp, but she was still trapped in the industry he helped build, an industry that now viewed her as a legacy act, a relic to be trotted out for nostalgia, but never taken seriously. For Kim Novak, Cohn's death was even more disorienting. She was now the biggest star at the studio, the undisputed queen of the lot. But she was a queen without a king. She was left alone at the peak of the mountain, surrounded by executives who viewed her as a cash cow, but lacked Cohn's obsessive, albeit toxic, vision. She had won the war. She had the top billing. She had the fame, but she was hollowed out. She had sacrificed the love of her life, Sammy Davis Jr., to please a man who was now dead. She had starved herself, dyed her hair, and changed her name to satisfy a tyrant who was no longer watching. The twist of the story is that there was no winner. Pal Joey was a hit, but it was a monument to cruelty. Harry Cohn died believing he was a genius, but he left behind two women who were essentially war veterans, walking wounded through the glitter of Hollywood. The battlefield was silent now. The general was dead, but the soldiers were left to wander through the smoke, trying to remember who they were before the war began. And as the 1950s bled into the 1960s, both women would make radical choices to try and reclaim the souls that had been stolen from them. One would choose oblivion, the other would choose escape. The 1960s arrived in Hollywood like a breaking wave, washing away the rigid structures of the old studio system. The era of the omnipotent tycoon was ending. The contracts that had bound actors for 7 years were being challenged and broken. The moral strictures were loosening. But for the veterans of the Harry Cohn Wars, this new freedom came too late to undo the damage. The 1960s did not bring liberation for Rita Hayworth and Kim Novak. It brought a reckoning. It was the decade where the bill for their stardom finally came due, and the cost was calculated not in dollars, but in sanity and survival. For Rita Hayworth, the descent was slow, public, and agonizingly misunderstood. As she moved into her 40s and 50s, the industry that had worshipped her image began to recoil from her reality. The roles dried up, or rather, the roles she deserved dried up. She was cast in B-movies, often playing parodies of her former self, the fading beauty clinging to the edges of the frame. But the true horror was happening off-screen, inside the very mind that had once memorized intricate tap-dancing routines in an afternoon. Starting in the early 1960s, Rita began to change. On sets, she would struggle to remember simple lines of dialogue. She would become disoriented, unsure of where she was standing or why. Her temper, once suppressed, became volatile and explosive. To the outside world, to the press, and even to her own family, the explanation was obvious and convenient. It was the bottle. Rita Hayworth was a drunk. This narrative, the tragic alcoholic star, was one that Hollywood knew how to sell. It fit the script. The woman who had been Gilda, who had partied with princes and kings, was now drowning her sorrows in vodka. The press reported on her drunken outbursts at airports, her intoxicated confusion at galas. Producers fired her from films, citing her habit as an insurance risk. She was humiliated in the tabloids, painted as a woman who lacked the discipline to hold her life together. The tragedy was that she was dying, and nobody knew it. Rita was not merely an alcoholic. She was suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, a condition that, in the 1960s and 70s, was barely understood and almost never diagnosed in people so young. The drunkenness was actually the misfiring of neurons. The difficult behavior was the terrifying confusion of a brain that was slowly erasing itself. The laziness on set was the desperate struggle of a woman trying to navigate a world that was becoming a blur of fragmented memories. She lived inside a nightmare. She knew something was wrong, deeply, terrifyingly wrong, but she had no name for it. Every time she forgot a name or lost her way in her own home, the world told her she was just drunk. She began to believe it herself. She drank to cope with the terror of losing her mind, creating a vicious cycle that masked the true killer. The industry that had extracted her youth now mocked her decline. They had stolen her name in 1937, and now, 40 years later, the disease was stealing herself. Her final film role came in 1972 in a movie called The Wrath of God. She had to read her lines from cue cards, her eyes glassy and vacant. It was a ghost performance. After that, she retreated into the shadows. The woman who had been the most photographed face on earth spent her final years in a silence that deepened every day. Her daughter, Princess Yasmin Aga Khan, eventually stepped in, becoming her mother's protector and finally securing the correct diagnosis in 1980. But by then, Gilda had long since left the building. The vibrant, dancing fire was extinguished, leaving only a frail woman staring into a mirror, unable to recognize the face that the rest of the world still dreamed about. While Rita was fading into the fog, Kim Novak was staring into the fire, and she made a decision that would stun the industry. After Harry Cohn's death, Kim had technically won. She was the biggest star at Columbia. In 1958, the same year Cohn died, she starred in Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. In a cruel twist of irony, Vertigo was a film about a man who obsessively forces a woman to change her hair, her clothes, and her mannerisms to resemble a dead love. Kim Novak wasn't just acting in Vertigo, she was living it. Hitchcock, like Cohn, treated her like a mannequin, obsessing over the gray suit she wore, controlling her movements down to the inch. The film is now considered a masterpiece, and Kim's performance is haunting. But for Kim, it was just another cage. She saw clearly that Harry Cohn wasn't an anomaly. He was the archetype. The industry was a factory of Harry Cohns. She realized that as long as she stayed in Hollywood, she would never be Kim Novak. She would always be the lavender blonde, the replacement, the thing that generated money. By the mid-1960s, Kim was at the height of her earning power. She could have stayed. She could have played the game for another 20 years, accepted the slow decline, fought for the scraps like Rita had. But Kim looked at Rita's path and she saw the cliff edge. She saw the misery, the addiction, the loss of soul. And in 1966, amidst the chaos of a changing culture, Kim Novak did the one thing a sex symbol is never supposed to do. She quit. It was a jailbreak. She packed her bags, turned her back on millions of dollars in future contracts, and drove north. She didn't stop in the Hollywood Hills. She didn't stop in Santa Barbara. She kept driving until she reached the wild, rugged coast of Big Sur. Big Sur was the anti-Hollywood. It was a place of jagged cliffs, towering redwoods, and violent oceans. It was a place where image meant nothing and survival meant respecting the elements. Kim bought a home there, isolated and quiet. She traded the sound stages for a stable. She traded the company of producers for the company of horses and llamas. She picked up her paintbrushes, the same brushes the shy girl in Chicago had loved, and she began to paint. The press called her crazy. They speculated she had had a breakdown. They couldn't understand why a woman would walk away from the altar of fame. They tried to lure her back with offers, with scripts, with promises of Oscars. But Kim stayed in the woods. She found a freedom that Rita never tasted. She learned to define herself not by who desired her, but by what she created. There is a profound story that illustrates her metamorphosis. Decades later, a massive fire swept through her Big Sur property. It burned her house to the ground. It destroyed her scripts, her memorabilia, the physical remnants of her Hollywood life. It also destroyed the draft of her autobiography she had been writing. Standing in the ashes of her past, Kim Novak didn't collapse. She didn't call a publicist. She rebuilt. She realized that the fire had only taken things, and the studio had spent years trying to convince her that she was just a thing. But she wasn't. She was a survivor. The contrast between the two endings is the final heartbreaking lesson of their manufactured rivalry. Rita Hayworth, the love goddess, was trapped in the labyrinth until the very end, her mind eroding while the walls closed in. She was the casualty of a system that refused to let her be human. She died in 1987, a prisoner of her own legend. Kim Novak, the bland replacement, the plastic star, proved to be made of iron. She escaped the labyrinth by simply refusing to solve it. She walked through the walls. She chose loneliness over exploitation, and in doing so, she saved her own life. She is still alive today, living on her own terms, painting her pictures, riding her horses, an old woman with the face of a goddess, but the hands of a worker. Cohn tried to build a machine that could print money forever. He designed Rita to be the engine, and when she wore out, he manufactured Kim as the spare part. He viewed them as interchangeable components in his factory of dreams, but he forgot one fatal flaw in his blueprint. Components don't bleed, and components don't dream. The engine broke down because it was made of flesh and blood. One part rusted away in the spotlight, the other tore itself free and rolled into the forest. In the final analysis, the tyrant Cohn is just a footnote, a symbol of a rotten era. But the women, they are the light itself. Rita Hayworth once said, "Men go to bed with Gilda, but they wake up with me." It was a cry of loneliness from a woman erased by her own image. Decades later, we finally see the truth. We see the scars beneath the satin gloves. We see the courage of Rita standing before the camera while her mind faded. And we see the strength of Kim, the survivor who looked at the precipice, saw the ghosts of the assembly line, and chose to walk away. They tried to replace the original with a copy, but they failed. Because the human spirit, however bruised, is never truly interchangeable. The factory can build the image, but it cannot manufacture the soul. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Who do you think was the true survivor in this story? And are there other manufactured rivalries from history you want us to deconstruct? In our next episode, we are going to leave the sound stages of Columbia and travel to MGM to look at a woman who wasn't just replaced, but was slowly poisoned by the very people who claimed to love her. We will be exploring the tragic, drug-fueled destruction of Judy Garland. Until then, remember, the image is never the reality. Thanks for watching.